Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our second Higher Education Literacy Partnership webinar. I'm Sarah Carlson-Walrath, a board member of the International Dyslexia Association Upper Midwest branch and a member of HELP. Launched in 2012, HELP is a volunteer planning committee and supported by the enthusiasm and generosity of the following organizational partners: Minnesota Academy of Reading, Minnesota Reading Association, University of Minnesota Center for Reading Research, Minnesota Department of Education, Minnesota Reading Corps, Serve Minnesota, the IDA Upper Midwest Branch, Decoding Dyslexia Minnesota, and the June Stern Family Foundation for Children with Dyslexia. HELP's mission is to improve the reading and writing proficiencies of all Minnesota students, including those with dyslexia and other reading difficulties. We are pleased to bring you this webinar, Preparing Teachers to Support Children with Dyslexia in Classroom Contexts, with Dr. Kristen McMaster. Dr. McMaster will provide an overview of principles and practices for teachers to consider in supporting children with dyslexia in classroom contexts. Dr. McMaster is the Stern Family Professor of Reading Success and Chair of the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on promoting teachers' use of data-based decision-making and evidence-based instruction, and developing intensive individualized interventions for students for whom generally effective instruction is not sufficient. Dr. McMaster has been kind enough to share her slides with you, so look for an email later this evening with both a link to download her slides, as well as a link to the recorded webinar to watch again or share with others. Everyone is muted during this event. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box. I will collect those, and if we do have time at the end, we'll answer a few before we end the webinar at 4 p.m. Thank you again for attending, and welcome, Dr. McMaster.
Thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and I want to thank especially the Higher Education Literacy Partnership for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and a thank you to the Stern family for their support of my work and especially for their support of children with dyslexia. I know there's a mix of administrators, higher education folks, literacy coaches, parents, teachers in training. And I tried to keep all of you in mind as I put this presentation together. I hope it answers some questions or addresses some issues that you have in mind today. And hopefully, again, we'll have time at the end for a few questions. Normally, I would put this slide at the end, but I also wanted to just give a thank you to all of you. I know many of us have been involved in distance learning in some way in the current COVID situation, and it's been a really challenging time. And I just want to shout out to all of you for your perseverance during this time. And thanks again for taking the time to join our webinar, especially in what's a very busy time for many folks. So the objectives that I'd like to move through today are here. We'll start by talking about the simple view of reading and how it relates to dyslexia and literacy instruction. I'll spend some time reviewing key features of structured literacy instruction, what that is and what's involved in it. We'll talk about how these skills can be used within a whole class core context as well as in supplemental interventions. And at the end, I'll talk briefly about applying a database decision-making framework for collaboration with multidisciplinary teams of experts. And it's kind of a potpourri of all these things. Of course, we won't have time to get into real depth in everything. I do have some resources at the end, so if there are particular elements of the presentation that you'd like to dig further into, those resources are on the one of the last slides. So we'll start with a simple view of reading, and this may or may not be a familiar framework to some of you, but I think it's really helpful in understanding children with dyslexia as well as other kinds of reading difficulties, and also understanding what that might mean for literacy instruction. And the simple view of reading is really grounded in this idea that the ultimate goal is, of course, to learn from text, to read for meaning, to get enjoyment, but it's always about being able to comprehend what is on the written page. Unlike what Calvin is experiencing here, where he's telling Hobbes we're supposed to have this whole stupid book read by tomorrow. He flips through it, there, it's good to get that out of the way. Reading goes faster if you don't sweat comprehension, says Hobbes, and Calvin's on his way to play Frisbee. But of course, this isn't really the goal of reading. We want kids and everyone to gain meaning and understanding from the texts that they read. And so the simple view of reading takes this idea and divides reading into basically three important components. The R in the simple view of reading is reading comprehension. So again, sort of that ultimate goal of reading. And then its components are D for decoding, and that has to do with just cracking the code of the alphabetic written language that we have, which is made up of symbols that have sounds, and using our knowledge of those to recognize words, to be able to figure them out and eventually recognize them. And then the C side of the equation is linguistic comprehension. So that's independent of decoding. That's just our ability to understand any kind of language, whether it's spoken, written. It could be while we're reading a book, listening to a story, listening to other kinds of conversation, watching a show. It's just the comprehension that we're experiencing while engaging in some kind of language activity. So D and C are independent of each other, but we need both of them for reading comprehension to occur. And it's a multiplicative relationship. So if either one of those is zero, if decoding isn't happening or if comprehension isn't happening, then reading comprehension can't happen. Now, we know that both of these things are important for reading. We know that they develop together. There's longitudinal research that demonstrates that both of these skills start developing early on in children and they develop over time. We also know that decoding contributes more in general to reading in younger children. So as kids are learning to read in school, there's a lot more emphasis on decoding because they need those basic decoding skills to read even simple texts. And oftentimes those texts are simple enough that, you know, even though language is really important in young children, what they're reading might not be the most sophisticated language in terms of vocabulary and sentence structure and that sort of thing. But over time, comprehension contributes more and more to reading as children gain more of those decoding skills and now are reading more and more complex texts. They're relying a lot more on comprehension skills. And both of these are important to emphasize in reading instruction throughout school for some students, and then the emphasis is just going to change over time. Now, the simple view of reading helps to kind of understand what's going on with different types of readers. And I'm not really one to put people in boxes like this, but I think it does help us understand kind of the different kinds of difficulties that different readers might experience. And then again, the instructional implications that we might derive from that. So first we have in this box people who are relatively good at decoding. They pick up the code pretty quickly and can apply it to lots of words. They have relatively good comprehension, and so they might be who we would think of as a good reader. And this is language from the Goff and Tunmer article that I have cited here back from 1986. They're the ones who coined this idea of the simple view of reading. Then we have students who might be relatively poor at decoding or have difficulty with the cracking the code side of the equation, but have pretty good linguistic comprehension. And that would be sort of the profile of who we might think of as somebody with dyslexia. We also might have a reader who struggles with both of those components, so relative difficulties with decoding and comprehension. And then this is kind of a relatively small group compared to the others, but some students who might actually have fairly good decoding skills, but really struggle with the comprehension side of things. And those students, sometimes we hear them called word callers. They're the kids who might sound like they are reading relatively fluently, but still having difficulty extracting meaning from text. So I'll come back to the simple view, but I also wanted to kind of connect to some other terms that you might be familiar with. About 20 years ago, the National Reading Panel report came out and identified from the literature these 5 big ideas of reading. And these are based on a fairly extensive literature review of the scientific research that showed that these are the areas that really give us the biggest bang for our buck in terms of reading instruction, and are things that we should really focus on in teaching children to read. Now, they might not encompass all of the different aspects of reading instruction, but have certainly gained a lot of traction over the last couple of decades in terms of what we tend to think of when we're thinking about structuring reading programs, thinking in teacher preparation about what we should cover in our reading instruction classes. And so I think it's important to connect to that because I figured many of you would be familiar with this. So just to go through them quickly, phonemic awareness is generally the awareness that spoken words are made up of smaller parts, which are the sounds that the letters make. And then also the ability to hear and manipulate the smaller parts of spoken words. And this is a skill that's highly predictive of students' later reading achievement. And so it's quite important to pay attention to and to include in instruction. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Next is the alphabetic principle, which is the understanding that words are made up of letters that have sounds, and then the ability to use that knowledge that words are made up of letters with sounds to read and also spell words. And so that these 2 components really make up the decoding part of the equation. Fluency with text has been defined in a lot of different ways over the years. But generally, there's some agreement that it refers to fairly effortless reading, that we're not stopping at every word and decoding it, but reading pretty smoothly and recognizing the words quite quickly with accuracy, speed, prosody, which means we're pausing in the right places, using expression as we read, if we're reading out loud, that kind of thing. Vocabulary, just very basically speaking, has to do with access to and knowledge of the meaning of words. And then comprehension, while a very complex process, I think is well defined by saying it's the construction of a coherent mental representation of text. So it's reading text, understanding it, and kind of putting together this picture of what's happening in that text or what that text is about. So what does this all have to do with a simple view of reading? So I think we can take each of these components and map them pretty well onto the simple view of reading. So as I mentioned, phonemic awareness and alphabetic principle are really the code-based side of the equation, whereas vocabulary and comprehension have more to do with the meaning side, so the language comprehension. And then fluency is interesting because it requires both things. It requires relative accuracy and speed with decoding, but it also can be influenced by and does influence comprehension. So if you can read quickly and accurately, you can really focus on the meaning, but also the more you are gaining meaning, the more fluently you can read, because it can help with words that you might still be having trouble decoding. And so fluency is often thought of as sort of bidirectional in terms of its relationship with decoding and comprehension. So that was a really quick overview of the simple view of reading, but I hope it helps sort of ground us in what the different components of reading are and how they play out in terms of kids who might be struggling with reading, and now how we might start to think about those in terms of literacy instruction. So this idea of structured literacy instruction it's a term that's used quite a lot in dyslexia specific contexts. I know the International Dyslexia Association has a really nice overview of structured literacy instruction on their website. And so I borrowed from that fairly shamelessly, but and it's also in our Minnesota rule. But what it really is both the principles and content that would be included in literacy instruction that have a strong basis in research, especially for kids who are experiencing difficulty learning to read, how we might go about supporting their reading development. And so there's, as I mentioned, in structured literacy instruction, there's both general instructional principles that aren't just specific to literacy, but are generally supported in the research as ways to help people who are struggling with any particular academic skill. And then there's content as well, which I'll move to in a minute. The principles start with the idea that instruction should be systematic and cumulative. And that means that it follows a logical sequence. So we start with sort of the foundational skills and build on those over time. And it's cumulative in that once we've taught a particular skill, we don't necessarily leave it behind, but we integrate it with the later skills so that we're really building on those skills or concepts that are core for, in this case, learning to read. The second principle is that it's explicit. So for students who are struggling to crack the code of our written language, it's not necessarily just going to happen through lots of exposure, through implicit approaches to learning. Of course, it's important to expose students to lots of different literature and rich language experiences, but the actual reading of the code of our language is not really that obvious to everyone, and especially for children who are really struggling to learn to read. And so making that as overt as possible, making it just really clear how this funny looking written language actually works is really important for supporting students who are experiencing difficulty. So that would include modeling, so really showing how it works to read sounds and words. Guided practice, so that idea of I do, you do, we do, where we're scaffolding, we're providing feedback if a child is struggling so they can see very clearly, you know, where they might be making a mistake, and also knowing when they're doing things correctly so they can repeat the correct reading behavior and not repeat the incorrect behavior. Independent practice as they become, or as they come closer to mastery. And then that idea of cumulative review. So we're going back and making sure that previously taught skills are still maintained over time. And then there's a component of diagnosis where we're actually tracking what is being mastered and what hasn't yet been mastered so that we really know what to focus on as we're moving through our logical sequence and making decisions about whether learning is happening effectively. So those are the principles, and then the content, if you go to the IDA website, you see these elements emphasized, and they'll probably sound familiar after us going through the National Reading Panel Big Five, and I'll map them on in just a moment. But the content that's listed is phonology, which is the study of the sound structure of words, sound symbol relationships, which is using that letter sound knowledge to decode, knowledge about syllables, so knowing that words are made up of smaller parts, and then using rules about how we divide words into parts, which can help us decode. And I'll give you some examples of that in a little while. Morphology, which is the study of the meaning structure of words, which is really important, of course, for understanding the words, and can also help with the decoding component. Syntax, which has to do with grammar, sentence structure, punctuation, different mechanics that are needed to comprehend text, and then some semantics, which has to do with meaning. So again, these kind of map onto the 5 big ideas of reading. So phonology is directly related to phonemic awareness. The alphabetic principle relates to that idea of sound symbol association, as well as using syllables and morphology to decode words. And then morphology also comes into play with vocabulary. And the syntax and semantics components, along with a host of other key skills and processes, inform and support comprehension. So I'm just trying to show here that all of these things kind of relate, even though they're using slightly different language, and you might have encountered them or not in different contexts, but trying to make some of those connections here. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more depth, just kind of illustrating how we might use structured literacy instruction principles to actually teach some of these aspects of reading. And I'll focus on these 2, phonemic awareness and the alphabetic principle, because again, they have to do very much with the decoding side of the equation, which is where children with dyslexia tend to have difficulty. That's not to diminish the other elements here, and I think any reading program, of course, will need to incorporate all of those, but especially with our limited time, I just want to focus on these 2 areas to kind of illustrate how we can use structured literacy instruction to incorporate these ideas in our instruction. So phonemic awareness, again, the awareness of the smaller parts, the sounds in language or in words, and how to manipulate those. The key skills involved in phonemic awareness include sound and word discrimination. So if I say the words cat, mat, bat, and ran, if you have good phonemic awareness, you would be able to pick out ran as the one that doesn't really belong. In this case, cat, mat, and bat all have the same word family or rhyme of at, whereas ran doesn't really fit with that. Next, we have rhyming. So that's being able to distinguish what rhymes with particular words. So the word that rhymes with man, cat, or can would be can. Blending has to do with being able to blend sounds together. So if I said the sounds k, a, t, you'd be able to blend them into the word cat. Segmenting, on the other hand, is being able to pick apart the sounds in a word. So if I said dog, you might segment it into its sounds, d, a, g. Deletion is when you can sort of pick off a sound from a word. So if I said cat, if I said say cat without the k, you would say at. And then manipulation, an example would be, what word do you get if you change the t in cat to n? You'd get can. So just the ability to do these different types of manipulations and kind of playing with words in different ways would constitute phonemic awareness and the key skills involved in that. Now, as far as the instructional features, again, kind of going back to our structured literacy instruction principles, instruction in phonemic awareness should be explicit and systematic. It should follow a sequence where typically we would start with more simple skills. So rhyming is often, one of the first areas where we might start, whereas the more complicated segmenting and blending skills might come a little bit later. Teaching 1 or 2 types at a time. So if we go back to these different key skills, we wouldn't necessarily include all of these in a lesson. We might start with sound and word discrimination and rhyming. When we've done some practice with that and a child is getting pretty good with those, we might move on and do some segmenting and blending and so on. So just 1 or 2 types at a time. It does help to include the actual letters in the activities. So phonemic awareness can be done completely auditorially, but to start making those connections with print, it's just fine to include manipulation of actual letters as we're doing these activities. And finally, it shouldn't be the whole reading program. So this is really, I kind of think of phonemic awareness as the warm-up to the other kinds of things that we would include in our reading instruction. And it also shouldn't necessarily take up a whole lot of time. A lot can be accomplished with explicit and systematic instruction in phonemic awareness and in 5 or 10 minutes in general in a lesson. So we'll talk a little bit too about the alphabetic principle. Again, the understanding that words are made up of letters that have sounds, and then using that knowledge to read and spell. And the key skills involved in the alphabetic principle include letter sound identification. So for example, knowing that the letter A says A. Beginning decoding skills, which involves reading regular words, so words that conform to kind of our conventions, the common sounds that words make, and then the different word patterns that are sort of the conventions of our language. So cat is a CVC word, consonant, vowel, consonant. It's a fairly common word that conforms to, you know, the standard sounds that letters make. But then there's also advanced decoding skills, which include phonic analysis, and I'll talk more about each of these, structural analysis, and reading irregular words. And as students move through school, so typically in kindergarten and first grade, we might be focusing more on beginning decoding skills, and as kids advance through elementary school and even into middle school, they might be engaging and learning the more advanced decoding skills. Again, the instructional features that would be important to consider in teaching alphabetic principle would again be being explicit and systematic. Part of that involves kind of thinking about this sequence of teaching the different sounds that go with letters, starting with the most common sounds that students are likely to encounter, and then moving on to less common sounds. Definitely teaching visually and auditorially similar letters and letter patterns separately, which just helps to avoid confusion. I think sort of a typical impression of students with dyslexia is that they mix up their letters, especially ones that look very similar, like a B and a D. It's kind of like two things that are symmetrical, but they're the same. If we look at two shoes, we see two shoes. They're not necessarily two different things. And kids who are having trouble discriminating among letters might see a B and a D, and they're both letters. They look very similar. So kind of separating those out can be really helpful. And just to note, it's not a vision problem that students are experiencing in that case. It has more to do with how they're processing the letters, and just that they look an awful lot alike. And if you're already struggling with the code, it's really hard to differentiate those letters that look very similar. So starting with them apart can be really helpful. Then of course, keeping the end in mind. So the goal here isn't to decode words just for the sake of decoding them. It's really to be able to read text. And so it's important to be careful not to overemphasize decoding to the exclusion of other aspects of reading that we're leading to being able to read connected text. And then differentiation will be really important, and this is where the diagnosis part of structured literacy instruction is important, because some children will need a lot more support in learning the alphabetic principle than others. Some children will pick it up really quickly, and as if by magic, you know, you teach them a little bit, and then after a while, they can generalize quite a lot and not need as much support, whereas others will need a lot more time and that explicit instruction. So just know that kind of keeping and paying attention to how quickly students are mastering the various aspects of the alphabetic principle will be important. I wanted to share, today I won't be promoting any particular curriculum or anything like that, but I am sharing this PALS lesson for a couple of reasons. Later we'll talk about whole class instruction and supplemental instruction, and I wanted to share this as an example of a way that even in a whole class kindergarten classroom, a teacher might present opportunities both to learn and practice the alphabetic principle. So PALS is a peer assisted learning strategies approach where the teacher starts by directly teaching letter sounds and sight words and decoding strategies, and then students work with a partner to practice those. So in this lesson, the students would have learned from their teacher the sounds for the letters that you see, and now they would be practicing those sounds with a partner. So basically their 5-year-old partner would be saying what sound, and they would be saying the sounds g, p, ah, and so on, with correction when they need it, and support along the way. And you can see, so in this lesson, they've learned quite a few letter sounds. The letters, or the sound for a, t, and s were introduced way back at the beginning, but you can see that those sounds are still here in the lesson, kind of getting to that idea of cumulative review, that we're not necessarily leaving behind the sounds that we've already learned, but making sure that there's still opportunities to practice those. And then in this lesson, eventually students learn to use those letter sound relationships that they now know to blend into actual words, and then to start reading simple sentences. So that's just an example of kind of an application of alphabetic principle to a class-wide reading program. So it doesn't stop with those basic decoding skills. We have a pretty complicated language, and so there will be the need for ongoing support for all students, but especially those who are experiencing some difficulty with reading. So those advanced decoding skills include phonic analysis, where we're starting to look at combinations of letters and how they fit together into words. Structural analysis, where students start to read multi-syllabic words, and this can continue again into middle school where they're encountering more and more complex words. Irregular words, so we have a lot of words in our language that don't quite conform to the typical rules that we know about, so teaching some strategies for how to deal with those is important too. So I'll just briefly give some examples of these different skills. So one example of phonics analysis is teaching letter combinations. So we have individual letters that make their own sounds, but we also have the case where you put two sounds together and they make a whole new sound. So CH says ch, TH says th, and so on. This is not like a blend. So when you put B and L together, they still say their individual sounds, B and ul or bull. So a letter combination is when you're actually changing the sound by putting the two letters together. And basically we would teach these when students have mastered the most common sounds of letters and when they start to encounter them frequently in text. So maybe seeing when students are starting to encounter a lot of those words in their text, and then again being sort of aware of how similarity can be confusing, so being attentive to that as well as you think about when to teach these different letter combinations. Here's an example of how we might introduce and practice a letter combination. So I might say, we have the letters E, A, and together they say E. Say it with me. E. I'm sure you're saying it at home. And then I might ask you, what sound? And you would say E. And then after I was sure you had mastered that sound in isolation, then I might mix it in with some other sounds that you've already learned. So we would practice saying E along with oo and a and sh, which you've already learned. And then we might bring them into words. So we might read the underlined part first. So on here we would say what sound oo, and then what word boot. So starting to use our phonic analysis skills to both read that letter combination and put it into a whole word. So I won't go through all of these, but again, just trying to illustrate how we might apply these instructional principles here. And then structural analysis, a good way to be explicit and systematic is just to teach the rule. So we might have words where a suffix is added to a base word ending in a consonant. For example, if we add ER to bat, we get batter. If we add ING to farm, we get farming, and so forth. And the idea here would be to teach the rule that we double the consonant so that we sort of retain the sound of the vowel. And so starting to use students' knowledge of the parts of words to build on that into reading more complex words. And also morphological awareness helps here. So knowing that suffixes are small parts of words that have meaning can kind of help in deciphering these words because when they have meaning, it makes a lot more sense when you're trying to read them. So I won't go through all of these, you'll have this in the PowerPoint, but again, just to illustrate this idea of being explicit and really teaching the rules that students will need to know to be able to decode complicated text. And then irregular words, these are either not frequently encountered in our language or maybe inconsistent. They often contain letters or combinations that don't represent their most common sounds. So like break, the EA doesn't say E, it says A. So here are some different examples of irregular words. And we can teach kids strategies to figure these out, even though they might not conform to the most common rules that we have. They can still use their knowledge of phonics and structural cues, as well as context, to figure out the words that might be difficult. So bacon, you might sound out to be bacon, but using some of your structural knowledge as well as the context of the sentence would be able to figure out it's actually bacon. And then also some of our irregular words actually are sort of regular in that they do have generalizable words. They have word families like ace shows up in face, lace, race. You can probably think of more. So teaching students that even these less common spelling patterns actually do show up in a number of different words can also be helpful. So that was kind of my whirlwind tour of some ways that we could apply phonemic awareness and the alphabetic principle with this idea of structured literacy instruction, again, being explicit, systematic, and using our knowledge of what students are mastering and have not mastered to help support their reading. Again, a nod to the other areas of reading that we're not going to spend time on, but understanding that they are very important to literacy instruction. So now to move on to the third objective and start thinking about how we might use these skills in whole class core contexts, as well as in supplemental interventions. And here I'll bring another concept that many of you may be familiar with, but in case not, I'll just briefly talk about how in some schools and districts, we use this idea of multi-tiered systems of support to help students who are at varying levels of need in terms of what they require for instruction and how intensive that instruction should be. So all students, of course, receive core instruction in the general education classroom, and we expect that at least 80% of students should benefit sufficiently from that core instruction that they don't necessarily need anything additional. But then even with the highest quality core instruction, there will be some students who need something a little bit more, that what we can do in the general education classroom might just not be enough for some students who really need a bit more intensity in their instruction and maybe a bit more focus on particular skills. So we expect around 15% of students to need more supplemental instruction. And then a very small proportion of students might need something even more intensive and individualized, which they might receive as part of their general education or even in special education. So I'll be focusing on the core and supplemental instruction components of this, this multi-tiered framework as we talk about how to apply these principles. So in this table, we see on the left column here the principles of structured literacy instruction. So it's systematic and cumulative, explicit, and diagnostic. And I just have some suggestions for how we might apply these principles in both core instruction and supplemental intervention. So in core instruction, as we're thinking about how to be systematic and cumulative, that really begins with the curriculum that's being selected and really paying attention to whether there is a clear scope and sequence, whether it's logical, along the lines of, are we teaching the most common sounds first? Are we keeping the visually and auditorially similar sounds separate? Does it make sense in terms of what students are going to encounter as they start to read more and more complex texts? And also, are there opportunities for that practice and cumulative review so that we're building on skills over time and making sure that we're maintaining those skills? So really starting with selecting that core curriculum is, and maybe obviously, really important. And then that idea of explicit instruction includes making sure there is some time for direct instruction. And I don't mean direct instruction with the big D, big I, which is a particular approach to teaching, but this idea that there's explicit modeling, guided practice, correction, time for independent practice, so that kids are really having an opportunity to interact with the different skills that they need to learn to become proficient readers. With a whole class, this can be brief and brisk. We don't need to spend hours drilling phonics skills, but it should be part of the, an intentional part of reading lessons. And then, as I mentioned earlier, peer-mediated instruction can be a great way to differentiate and practice for students who might need more time practicing letter sounds and decoding skills that they're learning. Also, a lot of times in core instruction, we see teachers working in small groups to differentiate for kids who might need more instruction on particular skills. So that's another way in core instruction to build in some explicit instruction. And then making sure to check for mastery, making sure that the letter sounds or the decoding skills that are being taught are actually being mastered, and that students can reliably and correctly identify the sounds that they're being taught, use their decoding skills. And if that's not occurring reliably and accurately, then we can start thinking about whether more instruction or a different approach might be needed. In terms of supplemental intervention, that might be where over a period of time, students are identified as needing something more than what we can typically accommodate in the general core instruction. they might be working with an intervention specialist, maybe outside of the classroom, maybe as a push-in kind of context, but getting some more targeted intervention. And that's where, to be systematic and cumulative, we would want to select a research-based intervention that aligns with both the students' needs and also the standards and curriculum that are being taught. And I'll give some resources at the end for how to go about identifying such interventions. To make sure that we're sort of intensifying the explicitness of instruction, typically small homogeneous groups have been found to be effective. This allows for more intensive modeling, guided practice, feedback that specific students will need to become more skilled at their decoding and so forth. And then maybe even more intensive checks for mastery to make sure that we're learning those skills before moving on to new ones. Now, in our last few minutes, I'm going to talk about how we might apply a database decision-making framework to put all of this into practice. And really, for this idea of multi-tiered systems of support to be successful, it really does require teamwork, and that can be combinations of different folks at different times. So in core instruction, it might be classroom teachers, it might be a grade level team, a PLC. They might be working closely with literacy specialists and interventionists, sometimes special ed teachers, and other people who support students in their classroom. And then as we move up the tiers, we might be working more and more with specialists who are going to be supporting students with their particular skills. Certainly parents, administrators would be involved in some of the database decision making that gets us from one tier to the next. And all of this requires collaboration, some systems in place for database decision making, and professional development that can help both understand what data to look at, how to look at it, and how to respond when we decide we need to make a change for students. Now, I can't get into all of that in the next 10 minutes, but just to kind of pique your interest and maybe pursue some additional resources after the webinar. Just briefly, in core instruction, there's typically a universal screening process that happens where all of the students in a particular grade level might take a state test or a district test, like a lot of districts use the measures of academic progress or other standardized tests to identify students who might be at risk for not meeting end of year benchmarks. In addition to that screening, there would be a well-sequenced core curriculum that's supported by professional development and implemented with high fidelity, so implemented as it was intended. And then progress monitoring of those students identified through universal screening to be at risk of possibly needing more supplemental instruction. And this progress monitoring should be done using some validated general outcome measure. And I'll allude to that a little bit more as we go through. Then the supplemental instruction still occurs within general education. As I mentioned before, is typically delivered in small group, homogeneous instructional contexts, often by somebody who's been trained to deliver more intensive intervention and to maybe use particular research-based intervention programs. It incorporates those ideas of structured literacy instruction, so it's explicit, it's systematic, it's diagnostic. The grouping is flexible, so when it's working out and meeting the students' needs, we keep the groups together, but if it's not really appropriate for a student, the idea would be to change that up so that they are receiving instruction that's targeting their specific needs. And again, progress monitoring is key. So this idea of progress monitoring using validated general outcome measures. This isn't necessarily using the same measures that we would to assess mastery. It's more seeing over time whether a student is making overall progress in their reading proficiency. You might have heard of curriculum-based measurement, which is one way that's been validated to be strongly correlated with general reading performance. And it's a very efficient way to kind of get a gauge of how well a student is doing in their overall reading progress. And basically, we count the number of words a student reads correctly in a minute, and we plot that on a graph, and we can see over time whether a student is making progress. So for example, in this graph for Maurice, we see weeks across a school year. We see the number of words read correctly per minute. And this dashed line here shows what typical peers at Maurice's grade level would be expected to, how they would be expected to progress over time. And then we see Maurice's actual data, first of all, in tier 1 or core instruction, where we see him making a little bit of progress, but not nearly enough to close the gap between him and his peers. And so a collaborative team might be looking at Maurice's data and making the decision to make some sort of instructional change. And that might be to deliver supplemental instruction that's more intensive and can better target Maurice's needs. And then in this picture, you see that indeed that supplemental instruction benefits Maurice such that the gap between him and his peers fairly rapidly closes, and he seems to be on track to meet this similar level to his peers by the end of this monitoring period. Gabriella, on the other hand, we can see that in tier 1, she was not making very much progress at all. And then even in a context where she receives supplemental instruction, still not nearly enough progress to close that gap. So Gabriella might be an example of a student who needs something different, perhaps something more intensive and individualized than even would be provided in supplemental instruction. But these decisions would be made by a team of educators working together to look at the data and also consider other things that they know about these students to decide what the best course of action might be in terms of whether they should receive more intensive instruction in that multi-tiered system of support. So then the final tier in this framework would be intensive intervention. That would be the most individualized instruction. It might be one-on-one or in a very small group, delivered by a specialist, maybe a reading specialist, maybe a special education teacher. The emphasis would be on very specific skills that the child is experiencing difficulty with. And then again, progress monitoring is key here as well. So I have a brief case example. I'll just go through this quickly because it's similar to the ones I just shared. So this is Calvin. He's a 3rd grader who, at the beginning of the school year, we implement universal screening and find that his baseline or his initial performance is here. It happens to be well below what we would expect a 3rd grader to be reading. So we might use particular benchmark data for the school district, normative data from standardized tests and so forth to set a goal for where we would hope Calvin to perform by the end of the school year. And then we might draw a line from that initial performance all the way up to that goal. So this orange line here is the goal line. That's the rate of progress, that we would hope Calvin to follow in order to meet his goal. And then we begin core instruction using our carefully sequenced core instructional curriculum. And we would monitor Calvin's progress over time to see whether that core instruction is sufficient for him to meet his goal. And in this case, we can see that while he has a good start, over the course of a couple of months, his performance levels off. We can see this blue line here shows the overall trend of his data, and it's clearly not in line with his goal. So that suggests a decision needs to be made by his collaborative team to do something that might be more appropriate and more targeted to his needs. So then we might move to supplemental instruction, which is in this second panel here. Maybe implementing some more explicit instruction, targeting specific decoding skills and fluency skills that he might need. Again, monitoring his progress over time in relation to the goal line. Again, looking at that trend in relation to the goal and seeing that while he is making some progress, it's still not sufficient to close that gap. So that might be where, again, we'd make another decision to intensify the instruction, continue monitoring progress, and of course, we have a happy ending where he meets and even exceeds the goal. So this is just to illustrate how we might be looking at student data and making decisions over time about whether the core instruction is sufficient or whether something more intensive is needed to meet the student's needs. So just to summarize, we started with a simple view of reading. I think it provides a helpful framework to understand dyslexia as well as other reading difficulties and how that relates to literacy instruction. I tried to make the point that it's helpful to know the principles of structured literacy instruction to support children with dyslexia, whether that's in whole class contexts as well as in supplemental interventions. And that support can be provided through collaborative database decision-making. Here are the resources that I mentioned earlier. I've bolded ones that might be particularly helpful. As I mentioned, there's this PALS program that's a nice class-wide approach to supporting kids reading in core contexts. IRIS modules are great if you're a higher ed person and looking for resources to prepare teachers to teach reading. Those are really helpful. And the National Center on Intensive Intervention has quite a few resources for identifying research-based interventions to support students who might be needing more targeted instruction. So I see that I left exactly 2 minutes for questions. I'm sorry to have taken up so much time. But if there is a question or two that I could quickly answer, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, Dr. McMaster. That was a wonderful presentation. I have just a handful of questions, and I think maybe they're probably not, as with most questions, a 1 minute answer. So I think pull those back and I'll share those with you offline, and maybe we can get those answers to those individuals and not go too tremendously past our clock.
Sure, that sounds good.
So that sounds great. So again, this webinar, it was recorded. So if there's something that you missed or if you want to share it with others, it will be sent to you later on this evening, as will Dr. McMaster's slides with all of those wonderful resources. So again, thank you so much on behalf of the HELP committee for attending this webinar. Thank you to Dr. McMaster for presenting, and we will see you another time.
Thank you.